So, probably the most significant opinion on public opinion in the 20th century was from Walter Lippmann. And I want to pick up on his book from 1922 entitled Public Opinion. And he's going to pull together that idea that Tuckville noted in a very macro historic sense. He's actually going to get into some of the scientific details of how the dominant oligarchical class had indeed began to mold and shape public opinion in the early 20th century. And what we really have to explore here, if Madison Tuckville said in the New Age, it's really an age where public opinion itself has a sovereign force. I want to get to it what Lippmann thought about the very nature of public opinion. For Lippmann, public opinion was volatile. Public opinion lacked coherence. Public opinion was, in a sense, something that the dominant class, or what he would call the real rulers of the world, largely ignored and would pay lip service. In other words, the techniques that they had to control the hearts, minds, and people public opinion was so powerful already by 1922 that he considered it insignificant. And what he's talking about, the difficulty in terms of shaping it. It needed to exist in a democratic society, but it was so easy to mold that for the people that were the shapers of opinion, they thought it to be quite easy. He actually went to the point of saying that public opinion was irrelevant. In other words, what we were talking about when we look at the policies coming out of major democracies in the last 100 years, whichever political parties, the fundamental policies that we get that really involve the quality of our lives and the quality of our economy and our security are the same. They're moving in the same direction in a large sense. And that's because public opinion, says Lippmann, was largely controlled the whole time. Um, Here's what Lippmann noticed, and this was a game changer in human history for him. In the past, educated people generally learned opinions about the world, from a triangular monarchical structure largely. And in doing so, they got most of their knowledge from the written word, from symbols and from letters. In the 20th century, and Lippmann's really considered the grandfather of media studies, and that's where he's perhaps studied as extensively as he is in political science departments. But he would make observations in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So what he's speaking of here are very quantifiable statements, and he's using fairly good social science when he's making these observations. And he said what essentially happened, in short, in the 20th century, the new shaper of a public opinions was not so much about the words on a page, but the pictures in people's heads. So they noticed with the advent of motion pictures that you can give some select group information over here through words and symbols, and others in a projected image, just sort of the modern cave of Plato's cave. And he'd said always the easiest way to manipulate people was through moving pictures, and who could control and monopolize the moving picture industries would be the ultimate controller and shaper of public opinions in modern democracies. It was just about that straightforward for Lippmann. So, he's saying here that the key force in modern democracies is public opinion, and it's volatile and is easily shaped. And the people that actually are the shapers and movers of fundamental policies, they think of it as almost irrelevant. It's that easy to shape. So again, when we look at this model of democracy and how people can rule over themselves through finding representatives who create the laws, the model that we talked about, the rational actor model, would be that we know how to maximize our interest, we can make decisions based on costs and benefits, and that ultimately this is predicated upon the assumption that we have free information. But that's where the illusion comes in with the free information, because these industries, we can demonstrate, are and have been operating as monopolies of information. So let's move ahead with somebody that it tells us that more explicitly. And this was somebody closely related to some extent to Lippmann, but famously to Sigmund Freud. And I'm talking about, of course, Edward Bernays, again, paralleling Lippmann and speaking very much of the same thing. Bernays is going to speak more about propaganda, or what after the Nazi era became repackaged as PR. And he'd say the real force of shaping public opinion then would be PR. And those people, those corporate entities, and sometimes state and national entities that would shape uh, the media in terms of the language and the techniques of PR, we're going to be the masters. That's the idea. The master race would master the herd through the images placed in people's heads and modern methods of propaganda. And it's an interesting, Bernays would actually study undergraduate at Cornell University. He would study in animal science. And I'm going to get to in a moment the behavioralist revolution that was going on out of Leipzig, Germany, and over into Russia, Europe, and the United States, where these modern techniques were coming to really manipulate people's behavior through the method of behavioralism. So, Edward Bernays, let's just get right to it with this quote of his. It's a very overworked quote, but if you've heard it before, kind of think through it. If this is new to you, this is to the extent that Walter Lippmann is the godfather of media studies. Edward Bernays is the godfather of the 20th century of public relations and propaganda. And he was making these observations in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. There's, in fact, a documentary film called The Century of the Self. He's such a powerful figure. And under, with the deep state, this isn't just uh, some player here. This was a deep state actor who had influenced decision making in World War I in the Versailles Peace Treaty, in terms of the installation of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. He was part and parcel of helping create the Bretton Woods modern New World Order system. He was a famous Madison Avenue advertiser himself. So when we parallel this and this on back of Tuckville, we're getting this idea, we're pulling this theme together. It's this perception, myth of freedom, but what are the real chains that bind us? It's this notion that's endemic in democracies called public opinion. So let's just get to it. Edward Bernays. Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government. And isn't that what we talk about here at Dr. Deep State? So he's saying this 100 years ago, and he's not saying this like this is something that happened in the last 10 years. He's sort of lifting the veil in a very profound way here. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every act of our lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental process and the social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind. So it's this invisible government. What do they want to do? Do they just want to sell you cigarettes and bacon, as Bernays himself was famous for doing? No, they really want to sell major policies like world wars, domination by a World Bank and a Federal Reserve System. They want to sell you on the organs of international government. So they want to help sell you on the idea of globalism ultimately, or the New World Order. But like Lippmann, and what Tuckville was noticing was that people themselves are not rational actors. That model that we learn at the university in business school, that most of political science is predicated upon, he says fundamentally, here's what you got to get: people are not rational. We need models in behavior to understand how people work, but fundamentally, if you want to move, shape, mold, manipulate people, when you do it, you see that they are in fact not rational. They will do things and justify what they had done with a rational explanation, so it fits into the model. But fundamentally, Lippmann, Bernays, and Tuckville would say that no, that model does not hold true in the real world. Humans, in fact, this is great for the oligarchs who want to be a master race over the others. Bernays would say humans are a shocker herd animal, and that in fact they, because of their very nature, need a master class. They need elites to manage them, to tell them what their shapes are, what they like, what they don't like, what has a great beat and you can dance to it. That's what they're all about. They are the masters of projecting the cave images on the wall because somebody needs to do it. So, what does all this mean?